Summit preparations are underway as President Lee Jae Myung is expected to sit down with his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump at the White House this month. We have more press perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective. It's Thursday, August 7th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. President Lee Jae Myung and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump are expected to meet at the White House within this month. That being said, today we touch upon the potential issues on their agenda. For this, I have Andrew Salmon with the Washington Times joining us live on the line. Andrew, it's been a while. Great to have you with us.
Great to sort of be there. Sorry I can't join you in the studio.
Right. I also have Ruy Valdes with EFE Spain here in the studio. Ruy, welcome back.
I'm glad to be here, Sunhee.
Right, Andrew, we will start with you. Let's begin with the view that South Korea and the U.S. are preparing for their summit while details of their tariff deal remain unresolved. This is according to Reuters, of course. To what extent, Andrew, do you agree?
Pretty much fully. I mean, this is a deal worth potentially billions and billions. It's been a rushed deal. We're seeing the Donald Trump administration is shifting from a world of what used to be something approximating free trade to managed trade with virtually every one of its trade partners. And, you know, the question is, does the US have the negotiating bandwidth to handle all these negotiations at once? I mean, to me, that seems literally impossible. Let me give you one example from recent history of how these things are done in a more gradual fashion. You may recall back in 2006, the US and Korea initiated free trade agreement, FTA, discussions. Those discussions took more than a year by two dedicated, in-depth, specially detailed negotiating teams. There was a renegotiation in 2010, and the agreement, the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, the Chorus FTA, was only actually ratified in 2011. So that's a very focused, in-depth trade negotiation process between just two parties, the US and South Korea, that took, you know, around 4 years to pull off. And even that would subsequently be renegotiated. So this idea that the United States is able to literally remake the entire global trade order within the space of a few months seems to me extremely questionable. So it wouldn't surprise me if we're seeing negotiations on trade and tariffs and non-tariff barriers continuing for possibly for the rest of the Donald Trump administration.
Right, a daunting task ahead, I have to say. Ruy, before we delve any deeper into the planned meeting at the White House, what can you tell us about the political significance of this upcoming summit between President Lee Jae Myung and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump for President Lee?
Yes, well, everything points out that this is like the first major test that Lee will face since his administration began. The main topics that people are expecting to be touched, or at least people want to hear both sides about, are trade, the troops of U.S. stationed in South Korea, and North Korea. Right now, as Lee Jae Myung just started his presidency, he has a very high approval rating. The country does seem to be more stable after the whole conundrum related to the martial law and the impeachment of his predecessor, Yoon Suk-yeol. And as I was saying, this is the first time that we will see the President Lee really facing what we could say it's the major topic internationally when it comes to trade and tariffs and the new relations that the administration of Donald Trump is taking with their allies, with their own allies. Being that said, one of the top priorities for Lee is going to be to reassure everyone that U.S. will respect the pact that they just, or the deal that they just reached recently in terms of the reciprocal tariffs and automotive tariffs that were set in 15%. One day before, they could have been 10% higher, 10 point higher. There's also another debate that just rise today. Donald Trump announced that around a week they're going to impose a semiconductor tariff of around 100%. South Korean part, the presidential office, and we're trying to give calm to the country in saying that their own, or the South Korean semiconductor producers, will be exempt of these tariffs because U.S. has guaranteed that it will respect their status as most favored nation. If we check, for example, the behavior today of the stock market, yeah, it seems that people or investors took this as a positive sign, but as we know, with the U.S. administration, with the current one, we don't really know yet if they're going to respect this status until we hear at least from their side. And so far, we haven't heard clearly that South Korea will be outside of these tariffs. On the other hand, I will say it just shallowly because we will elaborate further. The other topics of interest are the defense cost sharing for the stationed U.S. troops in South Korea. And, well, in terms of if Korea will increase their contribution, if the troops are going to be reduced, and also if the troop will change their focus to also work as, let's say, as an umbrella to Taiwan or to also give more power to the region in U.S. Against China. And finally, and one of the most uncomfortable topics for both will be North Korea, because right now we still don't know, or the latest we have heard from North Korea is that they are still not open for dialogue to South Korea, but they did left a little window for dialogue with the U.S. In case they met certain circumstances, certain requirements that we will discuss further.
Right, and before we touch upon North Korea again then, Andrew, how important would you say is the upcoming interaction for the U.S. leader, keeping in mind, of course, his hopes of containing China, as we mentioned, and of coming across perhaps as a peacemaker, if you will, with regard to tensions here on the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, I mean, those are two separate issues that hold immense risk and reward for both Korea and the US, depending on how they play out. I mean, it should escape the notice of, precisely nobody that in recent years, US troops have redeployed away from their role on the DMZ, the frontier between the two Koreas, and they've shifted to a completely new posture down onto the Yellow Sea. So they're no longer facing North Korea, they're now facing China. This gives the US forces an extraordinary forward operating base for interdiction, for monitoring on Chinese naval forces in the Yellow Sea, its naval shipyards, including carrier shipyards in the Naval Sea, and its fleet command in the Yellow Sea. So this is really, really, really good terrain if the US are granted the strategic flexibility, that's the term, to use South Korea as a lily pad, a forward operating base for operations around the region. And this is what the Undersecretary of Defense Eldridge Colby is talking about, frequently. Make these forces much more flexible in their adaptability. And that, of course, could require a shift in the force package here on the peninsula. Probably less Army, more Marines, more Navy. But of course, the Lee Jae Myung administration, while it wants to maintain deterrence against everybody around the region, it doesn't want to irk China. It doesn't want to undermine its relationship with Beijing. So this is potentially a massive point of contention. And the security people I talked to about this issue are watching this with absolutely bated breath. We could finally see essentially South Korea taking over the wartime control of its own troops from US command, the dissolution CFC, the Combined Forces Command, which is an extremely virile war-fighting force, two separate commands, and a write-down, a reduction of US forces in Korea. And these all have massive ramifications for South Korea, for defense spend, for conscription periods, and so on and so forth. So there could be a real cascade effect coming out of this summit. Now, that's the risk. The reward might be the North Korean approach, because as we know, Donald Trump was the first and only American president ever to summit with a North Korean leader. He seems very, very keen on putting out fires around the world. He's made peace approaches over Congo, Rwanda. He's trying to do things in Ukraine and so on and so forth. So, arguably, he is much more of a peacemaking president than a warrior president. And in that, he may very, very well sync with Lee Jae Myung, who, again, wants better relations with North Korea. But to sum up, I think in this summit, on the security angle, it's going to be the risk of how the two allies see American forces in the region being postured against China. The reward, the payoff may be, relaxed, loosened tensions with North Korea, perhaps with a smaller US force posture on peninsula and reduced bilateral military exercises.
Right. And staying with the speculation on the risk factor, if you will, Ruy, some pundits believe the summit between the two leaders might actually turn into a showdown over, as you mentioned earlier, defense cost sharing. How likely do you suppose is that scenario?
Right. This comes way back since Trump's first term. He many times stated that South Korea's contribution to the U.S. forces stationed in the Asian country was quite low. He proposed to increase it significantly, 5 times, 10 times. He used different numbers. Then he mentioned it again during the campaign for the second term. And everything depends, as Andrew mentioned, of what is going to be, the end game, in the sense of what are they going to focus in terms of what are these U.S. forces are going to be doing in South Korea, taking into account the potential OPCON transfer, and also if they will widen their reach to take into account China and the protection of Taiwan, or also if it's just going to be a matter of money, we're going to keep doing a similar job, but you have to give us more money. Just to put some numbers on the table, what has been talked about lately is that what U.S. potentially wants is that South Korea increases to 5% of their GDP, their contribution to these defense sharing costs. Right now, South Korea contributes with 2.3%, so it will be more than double. This 5% is equal to what NATO agreed recently, but also at the same time, the numbers that Trump has thrown out since he started to talk about this topic were something around between $3 billion and $10 billion of contribution. Right now, South Korea contributes with $1 billion US dollars, and with Biden, they agreed that starting next year until 2030, it will increase to $1.1 billion. Being that said, South Korea is betting that this agreement will be respected, the one signed with the previous U.S. administration, but taking into account all the statements from Trump, his approach on this topic, we could expect that there will be a change, at least on the numbers, if not in the approach, if not also in the number of troops that will be stationed in the country.
Right. Andrew, you recently wrote a piece for the Washington Times about President Lee Jae Myung and his handling of affairs. That being said, how do you see President Lee perhaps navigating a potential showdown over contentious bilateral matters at the White House once the summit takes place?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Million-dollar
Trump
question.
is fascinatingly unpredictable. Let me just go back to something Roy just mentioned, which I think offers, some promise for South Korea in this upcoming negotiation. Donald Trump is very focused on economic reward. I'm not convinced he's hugely focused on global geopolitics and strategy. Now, as South Koreans, you benefit from the presence of the 8th Army, the 7th Air Force, and the US nuclear umbrella. That is a colossal package of deterrence, which is granted by the states. My sense is that South Korea, which is one of the world's, 12th, 13th richest economy, could very easily upgrade the burden share. Lee could feasibly offer Trump much more money in order to maintain sort of the USFK alliance status quo on the peninsula. So if I were advising President Lee, I would advise him to sort of take that strategy, assuming that is, of course, he wants to maintain the status quo. As to the question of whether Lee and Trump are going to sort of hit it off, I don't know. Perhaps President Lee should plan an American pop song he can sing at the White House, an inspired bit of public diplomacy. But I do have a sense that Lee and Trump, they come from very different family backgrounds, professional backgrounds, but they do both share this slightly tough guy, no nonsense, get things done sort of approach to politics. And I think there is ground that could very easily be shared. There's a lot of things on the table, political, economic. There are great rewards that both countries could continue to reap from this relationship. So I don't think we're going to have a particularly dire outcome. I would say the potential, the promise probably outweighs the risk. But don't take my word for it. I don't have a crystal ball, and I've been wrong before.
Right. Ruy, with regard to North Korea then, do you believe the two leaders see eye to eye?
Yeah, as I was mentioning in the first intervention, I think this topic will be particularly uncomfortable. The other topics, of course, will include tensions, significant tensions, but what we're talking, when we're talking about North Korea, there's some major element that could backfire to South Korea in case it happens, which means that potentially, taking into account some signs that had been shown by the US, potentially US and North Korea could start interacting without the need of South Korea as an intermediary or as a main participant of these dialogues. Of course, this is only speculations, but what is at risk here is that it's not only a matter of keep negotiating, is that South Korea literally gets pushed aside in these interactions, which will be a major blow politically for Lee if it happens. Still, so far, both countries have mentioned that they are still together in their ironclad alliance, that they will push for denuclearization of North Korea. But recently, the sister of Kim Jong-un made this statement where she was pretty clear that for the time being, the door is closed for South Korea, regardless of the latest actions of Lee administrations, like turning it down or dismantling even the speakers in the board of the propaganda speakers, and even a major one that I believe it has not been talked about as much, which is that according to many reports, the National Intelligence Service suspended broadcasting from radio and television of propaganda from South Korea that haven't been suspended in more than 50 years, which is, I think, is a big sign in the sense of how the Lee administration wants to approach North Korea. Being this said, we have the APEC summit coming at the end of October, and I believe, or there's a speculation also from many other pundits and media, that maybe Trump will take advantage of this trip to also meet with Kim Jong-un. Could be a surprise meeting, and what is gonna be left to be seen if Lee will be a part of this summit, if it's gonna be bilateral or trilateral, and this part could be discussed in this this summit that President Lee and Trump will have in the coming days. So in a nutshell, the North Korea topic will become key on how they will approach it, and everybody's expecting for them to have a clear answer on their position towards North Korea and if they're going to work together or in separate ways in terms of how they're going to contact or interact with Pyongyang.
Right. Actually, Ruy, the broadcast suspension by the NIS was something we talked about yesterday with Thomas Moreska and Chansaram here in the studio.
Okay. Well,
I understand you didn't watch it yesterday.
Yeah, I
Andrew,
sorry.
Speaking about APAC, because Ruy just mentioned it, President Lee Jae Myung is scheduled to play host to his APAC counterparts for the bloc's annual, of course, economic meeting later this autumn over in the city of Gyeongju. What do you suppose are the broader diplomatic implications of a successful hosting of this multilateral meeting for South Korea?
Well, I mean, again, if we could get Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, Lee Jae Myung, and possibly even Kim Jong-un, if not under the same roof, at least at the same summit, that would be an extraordinary diplomatic undertaking, arguably historic. I'm hearing the same rumors that Roy is hearing, which is that just maybe, Kim might be compelled to come to South Korea, maybe to an easily defensible location like Jeju Island, when we saw a South Korea-Russia summit many years ago. And if all parties could pull that off, that's going to make this APEC summit absolutely front page news for all the right reasons. On the other hand, to the best of my knowledge, there's no real commitment from the very, very significant players, the Trumps, the Xis, on whether or not they're actually going to appear here in South Korea. So, there's everything to play for. Best possible case, you might just get a truly historical summit, a great meeting of minds and men. On the other, you might just get a rather dull summit. No one serious turns up. And the biggest news that comes out of it might be, protests.
My fingers crossed for the former suggestion then. All right, Andrew, as always, thank you very much for your insights today. And Ruy here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you so much.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.